Gary Lauder, you're up next. I'm looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much. Let me just find the screen and share it. Okay, making the best of the worst. One sec. Okay. Thanks for inviting me. I'm honored to be sharing the stage with Dan Brown, who's one of my heroes. These are some eclectic topics that do hang together. I strive to make all of my presentations novel, useful, and non-obvious, as I do with my patents, of which I have about 16 or 17 issued. Lots to cover. So I tend to use a style that is based on the premise that since one can read much faster than one can listen, and you can listen faster than most people actually speak, and since spare mental cycles tend to lead people to do multitasking, and which leads to lower retention, I'll try to use up those spare cycles and rely on the Doppler effect, which is the tendency of stupid ideas to seem smarter when they come at you rapidly. So I'm a venture capitalist based in Silicon Valley, invested over $500 million over the past 35 years in over 140 companies directly and separately in over 100 venture capital funds. A lot of the problems are a function of muddled thinking. And we had information about SARS, but we did not have the trauma and scar tissue that the Asian countries did. And it's also the case that we and other Western countries don't respond properly to early emergence of threats that are known to grow exponentially. So obviously the epidemic and pandemic is the case that we're talking about now, but it's also the case for wildfires. We could use lightning detection and drones with thermal cameras to identify fires right at the outset and hit them early and hard, but we don't, even though that would be vastly more economically beneficial. The same analogy goes with pandemics. And more muddled thinking has all sorts of adverse consequences. So for example, there have been accusations of price gouging and profiteering against sellers of N95 masks, particularly early in the pandemic. And this was based on a failure to understand the supply curve, which is that when the demand and therefore the price goes up for a good, then the supply tends to increase for it. There was hostility towards N95 wearers as if they deprived hospital workers of them. And we have underutilization of sterilization for reuse of PPE. This can be done with UV light and with chemical sterilizers. And the failure to recognize that COVID was aerosol, despite plenty of evidence March and earlier. And the natural consequences are that we need to aggressively ventilate and do things outdoors, although obviously winter's coming, so we better figure this out quickly. There's another cause of market failure, which is the absence of IP protection and the profit motive that causes underpromotion of free and inexpensive solutions. So for example, vitamin D results in 54% reduction in likelihood of getting COVID at all. And it also results in you're becoming about half as likely to die of it. And that's among hospitalized people. In other words, when they sampled people who went into the hospital for their vitamin D levels, those that were lowest were twice as likely to die. And that's just of people who were hospitalized. If I don't know what the statistic is in the general population, but I think your likelihood of hospitalization is dramatically less as well. So that this understates the efficacy, despite the fact that the sun is free, pills are cheap, and it's more effective than remdesivir. We don't hear as much as we do about remdesivir. So let me just emphasize, so this is exemplary of why the communist notion that patents should be done away with and that then we'll have kumbaya is just a completely false premise, because in the absence of the profit incentives, you don't have even adequate promotion of those things that are already known as safe. In the absence of those incentives, you obviously wouldn't have the funding to do trials to determine if something is safe in the first place. So anyway, I already talked about re-sterilization of PPE, and another example of a cheap solution. It has been found that if you take a surgical mask, which generally is made of the same materials as an N95 mask, and you tie 3 rubber bands together and place them as shown in the diagram, that is as effective as an N95 mask. But however, it's not proprietary, so no one promoted that enough for it to be part of the general knowledge. So the folks who figured that out then came up with a proprietary and new and improved giant elastic mask holder. It's available at fixthemask.com. Anyway, that's just another example. So another life-saving mask that we would all like to see applied more often is this one. But So I'm going to shed some light on UVGI. That's ultraviolet germicidal irradiation. That UVC, ultraviolet C, is the far UV, which does not make it through the atmosphere. The sun emits it, but it doesn't get through the atmosphere to the surface of the Earth. And you can get it from mercury vapor lamps, which emit at 254 nanometers. Nanometers are a measure of the wavelength of the light. And LEDs emit over a wide wavelength, including in the UVC range, and excimer lamps at 222. It disrupts the DNA or the RNA by causing the two adjacent thymine bases. In the diagram on the right, you can see that the red thymines are bound together because when a photon hits that, it can cause them to bind with each other, which gums up the replication of DNA or RNA, would deactivate that virus and render it unable to replicate. So over 80 years ago, this was done in public schools in Philadelphia, and it showed that upper room ultraviolet fixtures could significantly reduce the transmission of measles among students. It's in the upper room because that wavelength is damaging to the skin and eyes, but those wavelengths don't reflect much from paint, and that's why it was safe to shine on the ceiling and not have to worry about it bouncing back into people's skin and eyes. After the measles vaccine, this was mostly forgotten. One can still buy this, but it's not adequately talked about, and it could be key for reopening schools. I've made some investments in several companies that are helpful, potentially helpful. One company is Curative. This is the only one of these that I invested for COVID. They do now about 10% of all the tests in the United States. Nanotics is a company I invested in to cure cancer, and they created nanoparticles that rapidly absorb cytokines, which are a key component of ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome, which is the main thing people die of when they have COVID. And so by absorbing those cytokines, it can arrest ARDS and prevent ARDS. It turns out that when after SARS, many people who got SARS were left with a long-term condition basically equivalent to chronic fatigue syndrome. And this company, Cortine, is developing a cure for chronic fatigue syndrome. And so that would be a pre-existing condition after people have it. And Soleus is a company that's developing a UVB light source to synthesize vitamin D in people's skin and other good photochemicals. And it's actually better to get one's vitamin D from the sun or from light than from just pills. And it's not yet on the market, but hopefully next year. Although they are improved in Canada, so if you're in Vancouver, there's a place to find it. And then last is a company named Heal, which doctors that make house calls and take insurance, of which there are many such companies. And the existence of COVID makes people a lot less eager to go into the doctor's waiting room. So we all hope with everyone's efforts, we will get rid of this virus. And I look forward to any questions later. Thank you.